What wondrous love is this, O my soul, O my soul? What wondrous love is this, O my soul? What wondrous love is this that calls the Lord of bliss to bear the dreadful curse for my soul, for my soul, to bear the dreadful curse for my soul. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing and joyful be. And through eternity I'll sing on, I'll sing on. And through eternity I'll sing on.
She's done it. She said she would, but none of us believed it was possible. She has killed our father. I went to check on him after dinner and found him choking in bed. This witch cursed his tongue, making it swell in his mouth to the point that he could neither speak nor eat. But this was different. His face began turning blue, and then he became so sick that I could not help him. And finally, his suffering ended. The witch, she cried out loud enough for the entire household to hear, "I've done it. I've killed old Jack Bell. I've poisoned him." Mother ran in and saw Father. I expected her to fall to pieces at the sight of him, but she said nothing. Just stared at the withered body of the man with whom she had made a life, for whom she had borne 9 children. Just stared. Then she asked me if I found anything strange in the room, how I had to stop myself from screaming, "Yes, something strange has just entered his room," but I held my tongue. She is my mother. I may be a grown man, but this is the woman who gave me life, and I will not be cruel to her. We searched the room, found the remains of the dinner he had tried and failed to eat, and briefly I thought perhaps he simply choked on his food. It seemed far more rational. This being that has troubled our family for 3 straight years, we have never understood her cause to harm us. Not even Father. And there are many that doubt that there has ever been a spirit here. But then not everyone who has entered our home has witnessed what we have. Kate does enjoy her little games. On his bedstand, I found the bottle of medicine that the doctor told us to try. When Father was able to swallow it, it had seemed to do him some good. The other day, he actually sat up and conversed with us for a while, asked me about the farm and how I thought we would fare come spring. Asked me to make sure my younger brother and sisters enjoyed a happy Christmas. I think he knew he would not last another week to see it. But behind the bottle that held his medicine, I found something else. Another glass bottle that I had never seen before, and neither had Mother. I held it up to the lamp and saw the contents were a murky gray color. The smell of it was awful. Then I heard Kate cry out again, "I poisoned him! I poisoned old Jack!" And the presence of the bottle became clear. I told Mother to get me a spoon, as there was none on the bedstand. She returned with one, and I poured a little of the mixture into it and called over the little cat the younger kids called Mouser. Mother began to protest as I offered it to the cat, who licked at the mixture before recoiling at the smell. Then the cat shot up straight into the air and then fell back to the floor dead. I looked at Mother, who was holding her throat, and I wondered if she knew what was in that bottle, and that was why she tried to stop me from giving it to the cat. I heard Kate laugh once more, and then I turned towards the hearth and threw the bottle into the fire. It burst into flame immediately, a blue flame that shot up the chimney in a flash. Again, I looked at my mother, and then realized that my younger sister Betsy had entered the room and was holding our mother upright so that she would not faint. She too seemed undisturbed to find the old man dead.
I am so happy, so wonderfully, blissfully happy. I want to open my windows and cry out to the world, Joshua Gardner loves me! Loves me! He loves me! He told me after church today that he wants to marry me when we are just a few years older, as I am only 12 now, and he, though, is a young man of 17. He wants to plan for a life together, establish himself before we marry. Oh, I can burst! Mama knows. She always knows. Why, I don't think anyone can keep a secret from her. She's just always aware of what's happening, and no one ever knows why or how she does it. One time, after Daddy came back late after delivering some timber up to old Pat's place, I heard Mama say to him, "John, it ain't right for a married man to behave in such a way with another man's wife." And he says to her, "Wife, what are you on about? Who's behaving in such a manner?" And she says to him, "You were, you old fool." I swear, I thought Daddy would drop dead on spot. He stared at her with these big eyes, and Mama just sat there knitting like she always does when something's agitating her. But I don't know what it could have been. Then Daddy says to her, "Wife, you keep that up and someone's going to think you's a witch." She just laughed, and I could tell that whatever's bothering her, she's just going to set it aside. I don't know if this is the kind of life Joshua and I will have together, but Mama and Daddy have always seemed so comfortable with one another, and I hope that we can have that. But I want so much more, too. Mama says, "Now, Betsy, you be kind to that boy, but you be smart about it." And I don't know what she's talking about, and I told her so. And she says to me, "Girl, a young man wants what he wants, and it is a young woman's job to make sure he knows his place. So you best make sure he knows that you are a lady and intend to stay that way." Once again, I don't know what she means. Then my cousin says you don't get to find out all the interesting things about being married until you actually get married. But she ain't married neither, so what would she know about it? Mama just said to make sure that someone is always around to chaperone us at all times, and for me to not go riding off with him, and not to kiss him no matter how much he begs. At least not until he actually proposes, which may not happen for a while. But I don't want to wait. I want him to kiss me. And Mama, with her way of knowing everything, she'd know the second it happened, and then I get the switch. To wait until tomorrow to see him again at school, and that seems so far off. And we won't be able to sit together. Who needs chaperones with pokey old Professor Powell there? I swear, he caught me wave at Joshua in class one morning, and I thought I was gonna get it. He's another one telling me how a young lady should act, but really, I think he's just jealous because he's alone and dull as dirt. But if I fall asleep in his class again, I'll be in real trouble. Fatty says he's gonna give me a cat to catch the mice that keep gnawing on my bedpost every night. At least that's what it sounds like. But the bedpost doesn't look gnawed on either. I told him that he needs to give me a dog to keep whatever it is out of my room altogether. Tired of waking up freezing because someone pulled a blanket off my bed in the night. It's probably Drew. If I ever catch him, he's gonna wish he was never born.
John has gone and done it. I warned him. I said, John, you keep playing fast and loose with them interest rates. It's going to get you into a world of trouble. Does he listen? No. Never has and never will. And now he's gone and crossed the wrong woman, and I don't mean me. John said that working with a woman on a land deal is a guaranteed way to lose. So he goes and charges Kate Batts 20% interest for the use of our slaves on her land. She needed the extra help and came to John thinking he'd be fair since her husband's been laid up since last December. Thought he would feel sorry for her. I told him, I said, John, you be careful with Miss Kate. She's a smart one. She ain't going to let anyone, man or woman, cheat her. Well, time came up to pay John, and she didn't have the money. Or rather, she didn't have the extra money for the interest. John goes and takes a big portion of her harvest as interest. Came home smiling like a jest, thinking he's done something great for the family. He got the money for lending out our help, and he came home with a wagon load of vegetables and wood. I told him, I says, John, you take that back to her right now. Now, that ain't Christ-like behavior. He tells me, wife, you can't read anyway, so how do you know what the Lord would say about it? Well, he had me there. But I think I'm able to infer a lot more from what I've heard of the Bible than he's learned from actually reading it. So he goes and sells the wood off to a neighbor and pockets that money as well. Kate wasn't having it. She, as John, pulled in to explain himself before the church. The whole church. He tells them he thought it was fair to charge her more in interest because she's just a woman, and he was taking a risk that she'd pay in the first place. Then they hear her say 20% interest, and his face goes white. He knew better. He just didn't expect to get caught. It's a violation of church law to charge that much. Usury, they call it. And that's when I find out this isn't the first time he's done such a thing. Kate ain't too happy that no one's making John pay her back for the wood he took and sold. She was grinning like a mad woman when she heard they're going to excommunicate him. So now, because John had to get greedy and take money we didn't even need from this poor woman who is trying to run that farm practically all by herself, John can't go back to church. And that means that I, as his loving wife in support of my husband, cannot return either. His children cannot return. Betsy cried and cried the whole way home because she'd always get to see Joshua at church. And it was one of the only times she'd see them outside of school. She thinks they're going to be married. Well, we can hope. But John being excommunicated may ruin any chance of that. Miss Gardner wouldn't even meet my eye when we left the church, and Betsy waited for Joshua to run out and meet her. But I told her, come on, you know his folk ain't going to let him just walk out. She cried so hard. My heart ached for her. Poor thing. At least Reverend Gunn will still come over and minister to the children. John may be a lost cause, but I won't have his mistakes cost him salvation. Betsy, I don't know what to do for her. Between Joshua, grades at school, barely sleeping at night, she didn't need to lose church as well. Sometimes I wish I had it in me to tell John what I really think of him. An example he's setting for all his children.
That woman is a witch. How dare she go before the church and charge me with usury? Humiliate me before the entire congregation, the whole town, because I was trying to protect myself and my family from this trickster. She will ruin me if given the chance. She hissed it at me as we were leaving. John Bell, she said, you are a crook, thief, criminal. And if it takes me 1,000 years, I will make you suffer. I tell you, it sent a chill down my spine like nothing before. My son convinced me to go hunting to take my mind off of it. What more can she honestly do to you, Father? She's just one woman with a feeble husband. She has no power. But I don't think he understands. Half the town is frightened of her. She always seems to know things before they happen. She has predicted the death of animals, always drop dead after. She kills them. I know she does. She claims that she's just trying to help, says she has medicine that will cure the animal. No one trusts her. Any woman dealing in medicine is a woman on the wrong side of the Lord. I'm shocked the church still stood after she walked out of it. John Jr. said that Drew had seen this strange bird the day before. He wanted to try to find it. A bird? That won't feed the family. Even so, I grabbed my gun and we set off into the pasture. But we didn't find a bird. Sitting in the middle of the cornfield was an animal I don't know how to describe. Its body held a strange shape. In 1 second, it looked like a rabbit with a wolf's head, small and yet still menacing. Then it changed, grew in size right before our eyes into this monstrous beast, black of fur and blood-red eyes. It was eating a rabbit. That's why it looked strange. That's what I tried to tell myself. Evil radiated off of it, and it began growling while we were still yards away. John Jr. aimed his gun and tried to fire a shot, but the gun didn't fire. The creature stared us down and began moving slowly towards us, growling with blood dripping from its mouth. I aimed my gun and fired 4 times at it. I swear I hit it. Then it came at us, running faster than any animal I'd ever seen, tearing through the cornfield as if nothing touched it. But before John Jr. could take a clear shot, it was gone. It had been no more than 10 feet away from us and then nothing. I looked at my son and he looked at me and we were scared. Nothing like that beast should exist. But we had been unable to kill it, which means it could still come after the children. We scoured the cornfields for the rest of the day and into the night looking for the beast. When we returned home, it was empty-handed. There had been nothing to kill. We even went back to look for the rabbit. The beast had been eaten, but all we saw when we reached the spot was blood, and far more that should have come from a rabbit. You did hit it, Father, John Jr. said to me. That's why there's so much blood. It came back here to finish eating that rabbit, and it was bleeding. He nodded his head, seeming so certain of this, but I wasn't. You see, that beast couldn't have left that much blood either. It would have taken 10 or more of them to turn so much earth crimson.
It wasn't rats. There weren't no rats. It had never been rats. I don't remember who said that, but they was wrong. The non-sounds have gotten louder since Daddy got told to leave the church. And the sound isn't just in my room no more. It's in the boys' rooms as well. It's in Mommy and Daddy's rooms. It's in the kitchen after all the lights are out. I can't sleep. I don't think I've slept more than an hour or two a night in over a month. I'm so tired. I can't hold my head up in class. Professor Powell held me after school and asked me what was going on. I told him that there were noises in the night and that I couldn't sleep at home. He said something about a young girl's active imagination and told me that I needed to think less about boys and more about school. I asked him how loving Joshua had anything to do with the sound of rats in the night, and he stared at me in this way that I can't describe. I don't think he liked it when I said I loved Joshua, but why should I care about that? He's so old. And over the past week, it hasn't just been non-sounds keeping me up. Every time I start to doze off, the blankets are ripped off my bed so hard that I jerk awake. I run into my brother's room screaming at them to leave me alone, more times than I can count. And they swear they aren't doing it, that they're just trying just as hard as I am to sleep. Oh, are your blankets being torn off of you? I asked them. They stared at me as if I was crazy, but I'm not crazy. I just can't sleep. Something is keeping me from sleeping. Everything is wrong now. Daddy's gotten us thrown out of the church. Joshua spends less time with me than he used to. Mama always looks worried. My teachers tell me that I'm making this up and I can't sleep. If only I could go to sleep, none of this would be so hard. I would realize how silly it all is and see and know that things will get better. I would have the energy to chase after Joshua after school like I once did and make him talk to me. I would be the first one turning up in lessons and at school, earning candy from Professor Powell. He used to pat me on the head when I got good grades and call me his smart, sweet little girl. Now when he passes my desk, he still touches my head, but since I cannot raise it from my desk, it feels different. I just want to sleep. One good night's rest of sleep and that will all change. I would even take Professor Powell's kind offer to stay at his house for the night if it meant sleep. Maybe I can ask Mama if I can stay with a friend. I don't have to say which friend.
There's something in this house, and I don't know what it is. Something knocking on the walls, something making strange sounds in the night, something keeping my poor child awake. Betsy is not well. We sent her to stay with her cousin for the night to let her actually get some sleep, and when she came back home, she said it was just as bad there. The sounds had followed her. The sounds are growing louder now. Knocking has become footsteps above our heads and bumps going down the stairs as if something were being dragged. The fire will no longer stay lit in the hearth after the sun begins to set, and I keep imagining whispers. I'll jump and turn to John and ask, "What did you just say?" And he'll say to me, "I was just about to ask you that." The boys seem to make it through the nights all right. They run off to school each morning as if we had no troubles at all at home. They come home ready to do chores, ready to play. The other day, Drew came home holding a jawbone. That was the greatest treasure he'd ever seen. John saw him holding it and says, "Where did you find that, son?" Drew says, "I dug it up. I was looking for treasure, but all I found was bones." "You find more bones just like that jaw?" John asked him. Drew nodded. He dug up a skull and he felt certain that there was a whole body still waiting to be unearthed. John struck the boy across the face, hard, and the jawbone went flying and hit the wall. I rushed to Drew to make sure he was all right, but John held me back while he told Drew to take that jawbone back to where he found it and bury it properly. And don't you dare do that again, he told him. John, I tries to say to him, it's not as though the boys meant to dig up that body. John was so angry and scared. He says to me, Lucy, there are bones beneath our feet all over this property, all over the fields. Now, we can't change where they come from or how they died, but I will not have sons who desecrate the dead for sport. Even savages should get to rest in peace. I've never seen him this way, and I wanted to ask him why. If he felt so strongly about letting the dead rest, why was he out there tilling that land to grow our crops? How many skulls had he unearthed? It was almost like he read my thoughts, because he said in a low voice, I rebury them deeper, and I say a prayer for their souls. Every time I asked him. He nodded. Every time. I wanted to ask him how many times there had been, but I didn't. I just hoped Drew took that jawbone back where he found it, and that the prayers I sent up that night begging for forgiveness for my family were heard.
Now, I have taught the Bell children since crossing into Tennessee, but Betsy has always been my favorite pupil. Perhaps it's because the Bell sons have always been so rambunctious and less interested in learning. Though, my understanding is that one of the eldest boys is working towards becoming a lawyer. Maybe the seeds have grown weaker over time. Betsy is fairly bright for a girl, but her head has been in the clouds since she turned 12 and entered the earliest stages of womanhood. She already believes herself engaged to be married. How ridiculous. The Gardner boy is infatuated with her, but I do not believe he truly loves her. Watching her grow up, seeing the woman beginning to blossom from the little girl she once was, I too have become fascinated. She is a beauty, there is no doubt. Her dark hair, big blue eyes, her smile which can make any man melt when she turns it on him. Her figure, already quite developed for her age. I feel a need to care for her, protect her, not just educate her. It already feels almost silly trying to educate these young girls, as if learning arithmetic is going to somehow be useful in their guaranteed occupations as mothers and wives. I suppose knowing how to count heads to make sure your children are present might be helpful, but beyond that, but it gives the girls something to do when they aren't observing their mothers and grandmothers, so they will know what to do once they're married. And it helps them meet young men they may someday wed. I feel a certain disdain for the men I must interact with here. I know nothing about being a field hand, and they have never even heard of Chaucer. But each night, a child in my class is bid by their mother or father to bring the teacher over for dinner. There's a certain understanding that I deserve to be fed by them for taking their children off their hands for a few hours each day. I accept the offers respectfully, and despite overly dull conversations, I get to enjoy a few hours of family life once my work is done. But I am always happiest to be asked over to the Bell home. And of the Bell children, Betsy has always been the most enthusiastic about asking. Now, many of the young girls I teach develop crushes on their teachers, which I tolerate and at times take some pride in. They stare up at me through their lashes, trying so hard to be alluring before they even know what the word means. They know nothing yet of what it truly means to be a wife. They fantasize about love and imagine it to be all kissing behind trees and holding hands, poetry and pincushions. I see Betsy, and in the evenings when I return to my room at the school and settle in for the night, I imagine that she sees me, truly sees me. In the meantime, I watch her grow, change, and daydream about a boy who will never love her. I hold my breath. Thankfully, all these sleepless nights have tempered the affection between her and that boy. In time, he will reveal himself and his lack of patience. And so I wait.
I feel as though I have screamed for Kate Batts to be arrested so many times now that the words have lost all meaning. No one will arrest her. Not for this. I've ridden over to her farm at least 3 times in as many months to beg her to leave well enough alone. Leave my family alone. Because who else could be causing these disturbances? Who else hates me this much? But each time she greets me on her porch with a cool smile and listens as I say my piece. Each time she shakes her head and goes back inside, having said nothing in return. I have sent her livestock. I have sent her the money I made off the wood I sold. She has returned all my gifts. No note, no words from her slave. And the nights continue to worsen. Betsy wakes up screaming at least once every evening, shaking with both cold and fright. Nightmares. Endless, horrible nightmares. Nightmares in the daytime because she can't sleep through the night. Of all the children, she seems to suffer the most, and I cannot determine the cause. Her once bright hair has grown dull. Her eyes that once sparkled are now permanently glazed over from lack of rest. We no longer ask her to do chores around the house. She no longer does her schoolwork. Yet, she trudges to school every morning to escape the terror that she feels inside our home. I'm exhausted as well. And I can feel the exhaustion in my bones, feel it taking root, forcing me to acknowledge my own frailty as a human. Your eye is twitching, John, Lucy says to me. Did you know? I shake my head. I cannot feel it. Lately, there have been moments where I cannot feel one side of my body at all. I can no longer do the work I once did because my limbs have become useless to me. And I'm afraid to admit it. To admit it is to see the specter of death moving closer as time catches up to me. And I don't want to die. Not yet. Then the nightmares take hold. Lucy and I awake in the night, hearing whispers that have grown louder with time. Before it was just a buzzing in the ear, just an irritant. Now, something else. John Bell, I hear it say. Did you hear that? I say to Lucy lying beside me. She is shaking with fear, her eyes wide. I heard something whisper my name, she says quietly. No, I heard. Try to tell her. Then the sound of Betsy cuts me off. She's screaming. Not again, Lucy cries as she pushes out of bed, walks to our daughter's room. But this is different. The screaming doesn't end. It gets louder and more desperate. I hear her sobs mix in with the screams, and then she cries out the one word that every father loves to hear. Not like this. Daddy! I push past Lucy and run the rest of the way to my daughter's room. And then I cannot even process what I see. My beautiful angelic daughter hanging in midair, held up only by her wrists. Then I hear the slapping. Watch her head jerk first one direction, then the other. She cries. Try to reach her, only to be thrown backwards into the wall by some invisible entity. And I can only watch as my daughter is assaulted over and over as she cries for me to help her. Cannot. Can't even reach her.
Pushed past my startled husband, lying crumpled and useless in the doorway. Let her go! Screamed at whatever it is holding my child as though she were a piece of laundry. Let her go now! Slap, 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 slap. Sounds echo through the room, through the rest of the house. The boys have woken up now and are standing outside the bedroom, their mouths open wide in their own silent screams. Slap, 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 slap. Daddy, please! Screams to my husband, who seems to have collapsed in on himself. He just sits against the wall, shaking. His arms raised as if to grab her, but he doesn't move. Lord Christ, help us! I cry out as I try to reach for my daughter's feet to pull her down. Lord, help us, please! And then she falls. I try to catch her. She slips out of my reach and crashes to the ground. I crawl to her, wipe the sweat from her brow, pushing the hair out of her face, and see that she's unconscious. John! I cry out. She won't wait. Finally, he moves towards us, and it is then that we first hear the laughter. It comes out of the air. It surrounds us. We turn and turn, trying to find the source, but there's no source to be found. On and on, laughter until it slowly fades and then becomes a growl. We start up again, and I hear my name and the names of all my children. I'm taunted with them by this thing that has finally shown its true nature. It is evil. It is dark. It is no longer whispers in the walls or footsteps on the ceiling. It is no longer gnawing on the furniture and pulling at blankets. It has touched my child. It has harmed her, and it isn't done. I feel Betsy stir in my lap, and I look down at her. See her eyes flood. It's all right, baby. Mama's here. I've got you. You're... Can I lie and say she's safe now when I don't even know what she needs to be protected from? Whispered incoherently, floating in and out of consciousness, and I think to myself, at least she's getting some sleep. I watch her cheeks red and watch the bruises beginning to form on her face, and I want to scream. Beside me, John is sobbing, and the boys have entered the room, and they are holding on to him as he weeps. At a moment, I hear the boys crying as well. Men! I think to myself, aren't they supposed to be the strong ones here? I continue to stroke Betsy's face, and I tell John to take the boys back to their beds and stay. I will stay with Betsy until he wants to protest. He doesn't challenge the look in my eyes. Once he is gone, I begin to pray out loud. Quietly, wake Betsy. I beg for help. Ask for a sign to explain what is happening. Why? Has something come into our house and attacked us. Attacked my daughter. And then I hear Mom bend down to put my ear close to her lips so I can make out the words. It's me. She whispers over and over. It's all me. It's me. I try to shush her, but she continues. I'm sorry, Mama. It's my fault. It's my fault. My fault.
I slept. I don't remember much from the night before, only enough to know that now I'm afraid of going back to sleep. The morning sunlight lights up my room, and it is so lovely that you can easily forget how frightening it was when it was dark. I don't want to go back to sleep ever again, because as soon as I close my eyes and start to drift, I hear my name being whispered over and over, and then I feel the blankets begin to be tugged, slowly at first. And they are all jerked all the way off, and as soon as I try to reach for them, I'm pinned back down on the bed, and all I can do is thrash my legs and try to scream. I say try because it feels as though a hand is pressing down over my mouth. I fight to scream, to bite, to do anything that will help me get free, but it makes no difference. The feeling of being completely out of control of your own body at the mercy of someone, something that doesn't care whether or not it hurts you. It wants to hurt you. That is its only wish. It's almost a relief when I'm jerked up off the bed and held in the air by my wrists, because at least I'm no longer being held down. It's so sad. Trying to decide which kind of torture I prefer. Then, just as I take the first easy breath of air, the slaps begin. And for some strange reason, they're almost a relief as well. You deserve this, I think. You deserve worse. You brought this into the house. This is your fault. Because why else would this thing come for me and leave everyone else alone? It's only going to get worse, the voice tells me. This is just the beginning. You and your family will suffer, and someone will die before I am through. And I want to beg for mercy. Beg it to just go ahead and kill me now. Spare my family. Hurry up and get it over with. I don't want to picture my mother being hit or my little brothers pinned by their wrists as they are beaten. I would run away, but I have a feeling that it won't be that simple. It will chase me. But not just me, it will hurt my family as well until I return. And I don't know what to do. I think about begging my father to let me marry Joshua and leave with him. His family would probably allow it, despite the things my father has done. But then the idea of it hurting him as well, or children when we have them. Plus, you don't deserve him, do you? Voice whispers to me. He won't want you, will he? He will, I say quietly. And then with more conviction, he will want me. Slap! I cross my face so hard that my ears ring. I don't speak again. I roll into my pillow and cry. There was no escaping this. This is my life now.
John asked me to come a few months into their situation. I was understandably skeptical. I've always been a man of strong faith, and I'm a firm believer in the existence of miracles. But something about what had been described to me thus far sounded impossible. A girl being suspended from the ceiling by invisible hands, slapped multiple times, hard enough to leave a mark, and yet no one had seen who or what struck her. It sounded to me as if someone was going out of their way to frighten the Bells, possibly for revenge. John Bell hadn't always been the most honorable man in the community, especially when it came to money, but he had always been fair to me and mine, and I knew he and Lucy were solid in their Christian faith. John read the Bible aloud to his wife and children each night, and his children were all clean and well behaved. So, who would want to harm them, and for what cause? John asked me and my sons to stay with them to witness the events for myself, and I happily obliged. I felt no fear in doing so. The Lord was always with me, so nothing evil could touch me. We all stayed up late, myself, John, Lucy, my boys, and his elder boys. Betsy, bless her, went to bed early, and her younger brothers went shortly thereafter. We sat up by the fire, taking turns reading from the Bible, and I said prayers of protection and blessing before we retired to pallets on the kitchen floor. No sooner were all the lights out that the noises began. It started as a knocking sound on the walls. I told my eldest boy to check outside, and he grabbed a gun and walked out onto the porch to look around. He came back and reported that no one was around outside, but the knocking had never ceased. As soon as he laid back down, the blankets were torn off all of us at once by invisible hands. My younger son cried out, holding the side of his head, "Something just jerked at my hair, Father." Then the whispers began. I heard my name hissed over and over again, almost to taunt me. A chair flipped over, and the table skidded across the room and crashed into the wall. Lucy sat crying softly in the corner, her eyes on the ceiling, and I knew she was waiting for Betsy to start screaming. Her eyes were wild with fear, and I knew this was no joke. Lucy had the look of a woman who was desperate to protect her babies and felt helpless to do so. The whispers continued again and again, saying each of our names. My sons covered their ears and sank to the floor, terrified. Then the whispers turned into other strange sounds. A faint growl, the sounds of a creature chewing on something and enjoying the taste. A dark laugh. Finally, I stood up from my pallet and cried out, "In the name of the Lord, what or who are you? What do you want?" The noises ceased, and we watched each other, unable to breathe as we waited to see what would come next. It seems as if the entity was considering its next move, trying to come up with an answer to the question I had asked of it, or, having invoked the spirit of the Almighty, perhaps it was powerless now. I opened my mouth to say so, but all at once the sounds started up again. The knocking, the whispers, the growling, the chairs seeming to dance on the wood floor. Blankets were pulled off all of us and thrown across the room, and the boys both screamed at the same time as their hair was pulled. And then, from upstairs, came the screams of Betsy Bell. And I didn't need to guess what was happening. John, Lucy, and my boys all thundered up the stairs, and I could hear the slaps. I sank to my knees and began to pray, "Lord, deliver us from this evil. Deliver us, your faithful servants. Lord, help us." The entity chuckled right next to my ear. It was all I needed to know that we were dealing with something beyond my comprehension. John needed help, much more than what I could provide. When he came back downstairs after the slaps and crying had ceased, he looked at me bewildered. "Tell others," I told him. Tell the preachers. Tell your neighbors. Tell every man of faith you can think of. You need an army, John. An army of the faithful to guide you through this. Will you stand by me, he asked, reaching to take hold of my arm. Of course I will, I told him. Me and my family, we are always with you. Send Betsy to stay with us for a while, just until we figure this out. John crossed the room, uprighted a chair, and sank into it. I need to think on that, he replied. It seems to follow her, and yet, even when she is gone, it stays with us as well. I don't want it harming your household. He looked up at me, tears brimming in his eyes. Do you think we should call in that teacher? I don't know if he's a man of faith, but he is far more educated than we are. Perhaps he will have some suggestions. I considered this. I didn't care for Richard Powell. He had always seemed very arrogant, as though we were all beneath him. If you feel he can help us, then ask him to come, ask him to stay. It may take more to convince him than the rest of us.
Betsy has approached me and asked me to come stay at her house. My father asked that you come, she told me. She still has the look about her of someone who has not slept for weeks. Perhaps her conscience has begun to get her. Perhaps she stayed up late each night asking herself if it's wise to carry on with a gardener boy when we all know nothing shall come of it. But I don't ask these questions. Her blue eyes look sunken, and I miss the rosiness that's gone from her cheeks. I reach out a hand and stroke her cheek, then I slide it up to her forehead when I see other students entering the building. Are you feverish, Betsy? Betsy, are you well? I hear a male voice close behind her. Gardner. Betsy's eyes briefly flash brightly as she turns to face him, pushing my hand away from her face as she does so. Well, I'm all right, Joshua, she tells him. And I watch him place his own hand on her cheek. Well, you don't feel warm, he says, before taking one of her other hands between both of his. Fraternizing, Mr. Gardner? I say aloud as I turn away and walk to my chalkboard. No more than you were, I hear him mutter. Now, I could ignore this and know it might be wiser if I did, but the pleasure of making him suffer in any small measures is impossible to resist. And you will be staying after class, Mr. Gardner, I tell him. But I hear Betsy begin, and I turn to face her. She averts her eyes and says quietly, he was going to walk me home this afternoon. Now, both look disappointed at my disruption of their plans, but it does not dissuade me. Perhaps one of your brothers can escort you home, Betsy, and you may tell your father that I will arrive as soon as Mr. Gardner has finished cleaning all the desks and blackboards. I turn to glare at Gardner and find his expression nearly as cold. You will tell them, won't you, Betsy? He has a right to know about the boy who hopes to marry his daughter. Betsy's cheeks flushed, and she turns away from me and goes to sit down. Within an hour, I see that she is once again asleep at her desk. When class ends, I must shake her awake and see her smile sleepily at my touch before she opens her eyes. Then she jerks upright, pushes up from her desk, and exits the building, calling goodbye to Gardner over her shoulder. Now, I take my time punishing Gardner, even while knowing it delays my visit to the Bell House. At one point, while I'm working on my ciphering book, attempting to solve another one of my father's impossible equations, Gardner asks why I will be staying the night at Betsy's home. I don't know yet, Mr. Gardner, but I hardly think it's any of your concern. He's quiet for several moments, and I continue my work. Is this about the spirit that's been torturing poor Betsy, he asked after a while. I don't believe in spirits, I reply, and only a fool would entertain the notion that the dead have any interest in the living. I meet his eye and find him staring at me, perplexed. Now, the Bible speaks of spirits, he argues. The Bible says, the Bible also speaks of the sky raining fire, of seas being parted by nothing more than the wishes of a single man that it should do so, of men returning from the dead. Have you witnessed anything such as this? Have you seen spirits for yourself? Gardner swallows heavily and shakes his head at me. And yet, you still believe such things to be possible with no scientific explanation. He looks down at his feet before answering. I believe the word of God, sir. I can't help but smile. You may leave, Mr. Gardner.
My hope that Richard Powell would walk into this house and diagnose the cause, provide a scientific explanation, and then a solution was all in vain. Not because he couldn't offer an explanation or a solution, however. Indeed, this was the night the spirit decided not to show itself. Richard arrived in time for dinner and told me and my family almost immediately that he did not believe in spirit entities. I understand the need to place your disturbances in a spiritual context, but it is simply outside the realm of possibility. There has never been a proven case of either spirit possession or genuine disturbances by those who have shuffled off this mortal coil. I recall thinking to myself, he is going to wish he had not said these things. I pictured the spirit taking great enjoyment in proving him wrong, and I worried briefly for his safety. Think of all the pain inflicted on believers. What would it do to someone who openly denied its existence? Richard and I spent the evening going over passages in the Bible as I tried to show him the written evidence he claimed didn't exist, though it was obvious that he was humoring me. For every passage I showed him, he would flip to one he claimed contradicted it. Couldn't deny his knowledge of the Word of God, but I did not feel that he respected it greatly. Betsy excused herself almost as soon as we finished eating, and I watched Richard and my daughter exchange glances as she climbed the stairs. I had never considered this man to be an appropriate suitor to my daughter, and I said as much once Lucy and the boys retired for the evening. His face blanched, and he avoided meeting my eyes for several minutes after. Nothing is settled yet, of course, I began. But it is likely that she will marry the Gardner boy. His family approves of the marriage, and they are well respected in the community. It would be a good match for her. Of course, he replied, but his disapproval was evident. Young Mr. Gardner certainly seems to have affection for your daughter, perhaps more than is appropriate. When I started to ask what he was referring to, he continued with his critique. Gardner is a lazy young man with little to no ambition. I question his ability to provide a proper home for Betsy, and I have had to remind him to keep his hands to himself on more than one occasion. I studied his face as he spoke, and there was no disguising his disgust. You don't approve, I see, but I have to ask you if you feel, has he been overly forward with my child? Do you believe he has violated her in some way? Richard considered this for a moment before replying. I do know that Betsy's trouble seemed to begin after she and Gardner started to get closer. Her lack of sleep, her hallucinations, no. She is not the only one who, let me finish, he cut in. You ask if I feel that he has violated her. While I have not seen any direct evidence of this, your daughter has been exhibiting very clear signs of shame. Sometimes feelings of intense shame or guilt can manifest in ways that may seem unusual. I promise you, they're perfectly normal. Are you saying that you believe Betsy is causing? I believe that it may be possible for these disturbances you say you have experienced are nothing more than a cry for help. Her way of expressing her pain. You say she is the one who is abused most by this entity. Doesn't that tell you something? Whether or not there is a spirit haunting your home, it appears that Betsy is the cause. And yet, while you are here, all is quiet. Yes, he replied, and a small smile crossed his face. I believe that should tell you something as well. Either the cause of this disturbance knows that I will see through its tricks, or Betsy feels safer in my presence. I frowned as I weighed his words, though I could not fault his logic. My faith told me that there had to be a spiritual component, simply because of the impossible nature of the events. But if the sole explanation was a traumatized child, what would be the remedy in your opinion? I asked him, after several long moments considering his words. He gave me a thoughtful look. I would set aside the prospect of her marrying Gardner. But it is what she wants. And it is what I have wanted for her. But is it right for her? Suppose Gardner has harmed her already. Would you want to condemn her to a lifetime with her abuser? I could feel heat flooding my face as anger spread through me. If the Gardner boy had already had his way with her, how dare he? If what you say is true, who would have her now? Her virtue. There are some who would care enough for your daughter that such concerns would be trivial to them, he replied, almost a little too quickly. And they would happily receive her in a marriage, even with her defects. He smiled at me then, warmly, and clearly no spirits would trouble her when I am with her. I turned away, watched the fire, enjoying how quiet my house was once again, and still knowing that it would not last. It is something to consider, I said after a while, and to discuss with my child. You are her father, he replied. Don't you have the final word on the matter?
There's no explanation that I can see for why our home remained quiet while Richard's house slept under our roof. But it was a blessing, his peace. Richard insisted on sleeping in the hall outside Betsy's door, to be there should she wake in the night, afraid and alone. I get up to check on the children early in the morning hours and see Betsy's door open. I looked in on her and see Richard standing over her, watching her sleep. There was affection in his eyes when he looked up and sees me standing in the doorway. Then he leaned down and pulled the blanket up from where he must have kicked it off in the night. I heard a sound, he told me. He met me in the hallway, pulling her bedroom door shut behind me. I was concerned. Mr. Powell, I said, you don't have to explain yourself to me. This is the first peace my daughter has had in months. I can't say I understand it, but I'm truly grateful for it. Been touched by the angel. He cuts me off by smiling and shaking his head. I was happy to be here to help her. And I will come as often as I'm asked until this matter resolves itself. You only need request. He patted my arm gently and then began to send in the stairs. I must go and get ready for the day now, he told me. And when I offered him breakfast, he shook his head again and said it was not necessary. You've already been more than hospitable. I need not trouble you further. He pulled on his coat, and then he was gone. That evening, John told me of Mr. Powell's thoughts on the situation, and my feelings of comfort and peace rapidly faded away. I cannot believe Joshua capable of such things. John loves our daughter. I can see that he does. I do not understand how your faith in him, your faith in the Lord is shaken so easily. Mr. Powell's presence stayed the hand of this creature. John hissed back at me. How can you doubt the miracle you witnessed here? Other men of faith have witnessed this evil, but only this man of science could quell it. John, you are too easily fooled. I cannot explain the quiet of last night or why the evil has yet to return, but you are willing to give up on all you believe and trust a man who clearly has no respect for our Lord. John, I cannot. I will not. Then my words were cut off at the sound of Betsy's screams above us, and all the chairs pushed themselves away from the table at once. And there was laughter in our ears again. So easily fooled, old Jack. The voice spoke to me more clearly than ever before. You shall not have rest. You shall not have peace. You will suffer until death. For what crime? What cause? Spirit, how have you been mistreated so that you punish us? So many reasons. So many crimes. For I was once happy, and now I am no longer. Something was taken from me, and I want it back. Plates flew off the table and crashed against the wall, and I met John's eyes and found my horror reflected in his own terrified eyes. Spirit, who are you? Tell me your name. Soon, the voice replied. But not now. Not while you question my existence. You have allowed yourself to be fooled into doubting me. Call on others. Bring others in to see me, and I shall share more. Until then, you and your child are mine.
Our Father. Our father began calling for strangers to come and witness this demon that torments my family so viciously. Mother sent me a letter begging me to return home. Your father's faith has been shaken, and he is not well. This spirit torments him night and day, mocking him and encourages him to subject others to the evil it wishes to spread. Come home, son. Help him find his way back to us. I fear what will happen to all of us if he continues to allow it to influence him. I, of course, returned home and found an endless stream of followers paying homage to this creature whose identity seems to change based on who ask of it. It tells some that it is a spirit of an Indian disturbed by my little brothers who dug it up and stole its jawbone. My tooth, it cried to us. One of my teeth was not returned to me. This meant tearing out the floorboards to search under the house for a tooth that had come free when the jawbone was thrown into the wall by my petulant brother. You did at least rebury the jawbone, didn't you? I asked Drew, who shrugged his shoulders in response. In the same spot where you dug it up? At that, my brother refused to look at me in the eye, and I knew that meant he either hadn't or wasn't sure if it had been in the right spot. Regardless, there was no tooth under the house that we could find. And once we admitted defeat, the spirit only laughed at us for working so hard to appease it. It did not care about the tooth at all. In the evenings, when we didn't have a house full of visitors to distract it, the spirit tortured my sister mercilessly. It would pull her hair until her scalp began to bleed and clumps of it fell out onto the floor. She would cry out that she felt she was being stabbed with pins, and she would begin bleeding with no discernible wound present. Seeing it torture my sister, my father, it was more than I could bear. And I would cry out, curse it, throw things at the wall in the direction of its voice. After a while, it began conversing directly with me, desiring to test my intelligence. Religion, science, philosophy, there seemed to be no topic for which it lacked interest. And yet, whenever Betsy's teacher came to visit and study the spirit himself, it would be strangely absent. This seemed to please him greatly, giving him an excuse to question my father's reluctance to allow him to marry Betsy. I watched the way he stared at her and the way she seemed to shrink away from him. I recalled how when she was just a few years younger, she had daydreamed about her teacher the way a lot of other little girls in class had. Something had changed in her countenance and her spirit. Yet, she kept her own counsel, ignoring nearly all who entered the house. Only Joshua Gardner received her attention. But when he visited, the spirit's rage doubled. I tried to convince Father to send away the never-ending stream of witnesses, as he called them, to stop making a spectacle of our family's troubles. Wasn't it enough for him to be excommunicated? The presence of this evil in his home would only bring further grief to the family if so many others were allowed to observe it. Spirit, I command you again to tell me your name, he would cry out day in and day out. And then, one day it answered. I am none other than old Kate Batts, of course. The glee that came over my father's face was horrible to behold. I knew it was her all along. Now she's admitted it. No one bothered to ask why the spirit chose to suddenly give its name, or whether it was simply playing another of its tricks. Father's energy returned to him all of a sudden, and in that terrible moment of realization, he said, I'll kill her, he cried out, rubbing his hands together and his lips curled into a smile I can only describe as wicked. I'll kill her, and that will be the end of this.
The constable came knocking one late afternoon in September. "What's that old fool claiming now?" I asked, after inviting him inside for coffee. "Which old fool might that be?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest and staring me down. "Oh, let me guess. John Bell. He's the only person who keeps trying to get me buckled. What's he saying I did now?" That spirit of his told a room full of people that its name was Kate Batts. In spite of myself, I laughed, shaking my head. "Why is that funny to you, Mrs. Batts?" "Because if I was truly responsible for what's going on over there, why would I name myself the perpetrator?" The constable didn't know what to say to that, so he switched tactics. "Why do you think John Bell would say these things about you? Why would he call you out as the witch that torments his family?" I couldn't help but laugh again, this time at his casual use of the word witch. "Because he and I have been fighting over land and crops for years," That's why. John Bell don't seem to know how many enemies he really has in this county. He's been cheating his neighbors for years. That's what got him kicked out of the church, right? But why would he call you a witch, Mrs. Batts? Why would others around here call you a witch? Again, I laughed. My poor husband Frederick had been an invalid for years now, and with no sons here to help us, I began managing the farm alone. People don't tend to like when a woman takes care of things herself. Because I didn't allow me and my husband to starve to death when he got sick, and because people in the county often turn to me when they are sick but the doctor won't come. They don't like to admit that they come to me, but they still come. And because I've delivered more babies than that doctor. I'm a woman who refused to roll over and die simply because a man could no longer care for me. God forbid. Finally, he decided to leave, realizing that even if I was responsible for the happenings at the Bell Farms, there was no way to prove it. As he was leaving, I called out, "Who's the one that's suffering the most over there?" He turned and gave me a strange look. "How did you—" "The daughter, Betsy." Nodded slowly, taking this in. I felt a stab of sympathy for the girl. This girl I had never met who was kin to the man who hated me most in the world. "Tell John," I started, but then I bit off my words. "Ma'am?" the constable asked. I shook my head. No one was going to believe me anyway. "Never mind. I hope things get better over there." Once he was gone, I went and checked on Frederick, my poor husband who had stopped being of use to me years ago. "You know what's the matter over there, Katie?" he mumbled at me, his words slurring a bit. We don't converse much anymore as it takes so much out of him. I have an idea of what's happening. I'm surprised Lucy hasn't figured it out herself yet. I shook my head sadly. Lucy Bell could see things just as well as I could, only her extra sight frightened her. This fear also left her open to harm. "Can you help?" Frederick murmured, and I nodded. "I probably could, if they'd let me." I reached for the bowl of soup I had made before the constable turned up, and I began to feed Frederick. They don't want my kind of help, though. I tell you this, all I'd have to do is walk the borders of that property 3 times, and I'd know for sure what has of them. And all I'd have to do is set eyes on the one who sent it out, and I would know they did. That kind of working leaves a stain. Not everyone can see it. Not everyone can sense it. But I tell you this, whoever is doing this don't have good reason. And they don't have good intentions. It all revolves around the girl. I can only imagine. I frowned, trying to picture an outcome, but failing. "Before this is over," I paused, reconsidering. "Before this is over?" Frederick asked me, a dribble of soup trailing down his chin. "Nothing. This ain't going to be over. Not in my lifetime, at least."
More than a year has passed since the Bell family's new occupant moved in with them, and she showed little sign that she was interested in moving out. More and more the people would come, visitors from outside the county, determined to prove the spirit of fraud. John enjoyed the company, and he was kind to everyone who crossed his threshold, whether they deserved it or not. Many who came wanted to ask the witch questions, begging her to tell them about the afterlife or to ask why God could be so loving on paper, yet cruel in favor. Others asked her to tell them secrets, resolve disputes, or share stories of others she had encountered before she visited the Bells. At one point, she claimed to be the spirit of a young Indian girl whose body had been disturbed. Other times, she stuck to the story that she was Kate Batts. Eventually, everyone just began calling her Kate. It was easier that way. Religious conversations always amused her. Pastor Gunn visited the house and tried to catch her out for prayer, but when he pulled out his Bible and began reciting, the witch turned it into a battle of scripture. He would speak and she would contradict with another passage. At times, she was able to predict what passages he would read, and she would speak over him, her voice rattling the windows. The pastor stopped visiting shortly thereafter. When it was brought to her attention that she had frightened him away, she roared with laughter and then told the children, "Don't worry. I know more about the Bible than that old fool has forgotten. I will minister to you." In time, between the sermons given by Kate to the children and the outsiders continuing to seek her wisdom, the Bell house began to feel almost holy. I told John once that it was starting to feel like a revival around here, and he laughed bitterly. I don't think the irony was lost on him. After several months of visitors, I could see the toll it was taking on John. More and more he struggled to swallow, and he began losing a significant amount of weight. Lucy could only sit and sob as she watched her family sink into a pit of despair. It was only on the days when Lucy was so worn down with sadness that she couldn't leave her bed that Kate would let everyone alone for a time. She seemed to love Lucy as much as she hated John. "That teacher says that if I would allow Betsy to marry, all of this would stop," John muttered one evening as we sat and stared at the fire. It was quiet for once, and we basked in the warmth of normalcy. "Well, she's 14 now," I told him, "old enough to be a wife and mother." John nodded blankly. "I spoke to Gardner's family the other day. They wish for Betsy and Joshua to be formally betrothed." The fire popped loudly and a spark shot out, hitting John's pants leg. He brushed it away and continued speaking. "I know it is what Betsy wants. She and Joshua have carried on for 2 years now. I just don't know if I think it is the right choice for her." "What's making you wary?" I asked him, reaching for a deck of cards to shuffle. I was determined to keep his mind on simple matters. He watched as I dealt out the cards and shifted uncomfortably on his seat. "Powell said that Joshua has been too forward with her." "Then he should be forced to marry her," I exclaimed, bringing my fist down on the table. "If Gardner has taken her innocence." "Powell says it would be cruel to do that to her. Says that a lifetime with her abuser would only keep this going." "And what does Powell say you should do about this, then?" "John, sometimes I feel that you are allowing this man too much influence over your mind." John didn't reply for several minutes. His eyes glazed over as he studied his hand. After a time, I tapped the deck with my finger and he raised his eyes. "Powell says I should allow him to marry her." "John!" I nearly knocked over my chair. I leapt out of it so fast. "James, he is the only person not affected by this creature. When he is here, there is peace. I can't lie and say that I'm not tempted to take him up on his offer." Slowly, I returned to my seat and reached for my friend's hand. "John, you would be sentencing Betsy to a lifetime of misery if you took her away from Joshua. I don't think. I cannot believe that he would have harmed her. And if Powell is the only person telling you such a thing, I think you must ask yourself why." "I am," he replied sadly. "You don't need to concern yourself, old friend. I already agreed to the betrothal to Joshua. It was finalized this afternoon." "No!" came the loud cry of the witch, and above our heads, Betsy began to scream, "No! No! No!" Kate continued to cry out as above us we could just make out the sounds of slaps as Betsy continued sobbing. Lucy ran to her, alternating between prayer and pleading. How humbling it must be, I thought to myself, asking for help from both the Lord and the devil in the same breath. I glanced at John and found him holding his head in his hands, muttering his own prayers. "Well, James," he told me, It appears Powell isn't the only one who disagrees with the match.
How foolish was I 2 years ago when I longed to scream to the world that Joshua and I were in love. When I longed to marry him and be his wife, care for his home, bear his children. How simple it all seemed. Now I cannot even muster the energy to smile as he kisses my cheek while our parents look on and toast our engagement. To anyone who saw me now, they would think I despised Joshua. It might be what he thinks as well. I open my mouth to reassure him of my love, but before I can speak, a picture frame slips off the wall of his parents' sitting room. We should go, I whisper to my father, before she does anything else. He nods solemnly and reaches for Mr. Gardner's hand. Always a pleasure, my father tells him, and I can hear the plates in the kitchen begin to rattle. I squeeze Joshua's hand and he gives me a small smile. It'll all be over soon, Betsy, he tells me quietly. I promise. I'll protect you. As soon as he says this, I hear sound over the hearth, and I watch in horror as the cross that has been hanging on the wall turns itself upside down. John, Mother says, now. The three of us exit the house before anything else breaks. As we begin to walk back home, I hear Mother chattering on about wedding plans, what we will need to buy, what my dress will look like, where we will have the ceremony since we cannot have it in the church. I tune her out and instead focus on the dirt road in my feet. I do not say it out loud, but I am truly amazed that Joshua's family would agree to let their son marry a girl who is cursed. Father must have made them a fine offer. Betsy. My mother's voice cuts into my thoughts and I raise my head. But before I can turn to face her, I see a figure standing in the road in front of us. I raise my hand slowly to wave and I watch as it waves back. Betsy, my mother asks, what do you think you would like for your dress? I barely hear her. We're coming closer and I see the figure is a little girl with black hair. She looks close to my age, but it is a little too soon to tell. A new companion might be nice. Betsy. Green, I murmur, studying the girl's clothes. Green, Mother replies. Betsy, I don't think that would be appropriate for your wedding dress. I raise my hand to wave again, and the girl waves back. No, Mother, I say. I was admiring the green dress on that little girl up ahead. Do you think we might have a new neighbor? I feel my father grip my shoulder, and we stop walking. What little girl, Betsy? He demands. And I give him a confused look. We are all aware that Father's health has been suffering, but has his vision gone? Right there, I say, turning back to point. The little girl is maybe only 20 or so yards ahead of us now and is still waving at me. Then she turns her hand so that it is palms up and beckons for me, inviting me to come and play. I begin moving towards her, but I feel my father's hand on my arm, pulling me back. What little girl? He asks again, his eyes wide. Behind me, I hear Mother start up her praying, as if that actually does anything. I glance away from the little girl for a second, planning to tell my mother to calm herself, but in that second, she's gone. She was right there, I tell Father. Right in front of us. I hear him take a deep, shuddering breath, and then I hear my mother's voice. There was no little girl, Betsy. I don't even bother to argue. Stare at the spot where she stood, and I feel coldness come over me. The blackness embraces me, and then
I go to visit Betsy at her home the day after our engagement celebration.
Well, she fainted on the walk back and she's yet to wake. And as I step inside her house, I brace myself for something to fly up and strike me. Well, it's no secret that Kate does not approve of me, and it weighs on me more than I would ever admit. And I hear voices coming from upstairs, and when I hear that one of them belongs to Professor Powell, I stop and I strain to hear him. Well, this is what comes of the engagement, Mr. Bell, I hear him whisper. Look at her. Her body is cold, stiff. Then, to my great irritation, I hear him begin quoting just like he oft does in class. No warmth, no breath shall testify thou livest. The roses in thy lips and cheeks shall fade to paly ashes. Thy eyes' windows fall like death when he shuts up the day of life. Pardon? I hear Mr. Bell reply after several awkward seconds, and I struggle not to laugh. This man thinks he is so smart, and he may well be, but such learned thoughts are useless here, and though he may see himself as mighty wise, the rest of us think he sounds like a fool. Well, everyone's a fool in the eyes of someone. Never mind, I hear Mr. Powell mutter, annoyed that he has failed to impress. Well, she's been asleep for almost 24 hours now, John, and nothing wakes her. This is what I warned you of. This is how she shows you her fear and grief. Betsy and I have been in love for as long as I can remember, and not a day has gone by since I first realized her beauty and her sweetness that I have not longed to take her as my bride. And aside from Kate's torments, of what should she be afraid? Richard, before she fainted, she spoke of seeing a little girl in the road. Neither Lucy nor I witnessed the girl, but Betsy seemed pleased to see her, and she wanted to go play with her. Tell me, what does that have to do with the engagement? The two are completely unrelated. John, I hear Powell begin, and I climb up onto the first step to hear better. If neither of you saw the child, then I propose that Betsy saw a vision of her younger self before she was violated. I feel my eyes widen and my jaw tightens. Who has violated my love? We do not know that, Richard. While I agree with you that this all began with her initial plans to wed, there is nothing to draw a conclusion that he harmed her. It is slanderous talk, and I will not have it. That boy is to be my son. I was surprised at the strength of John's conviction, and my heart warmed for him. That was to be my father. Powell didn't reply, and before I could tuck myself away into the shadows, he stood above me, staring down at me with the eyes of a madman. Your new son clearly feels he has the right to spy upon you, John. Well, he came down the stairs and he pushed past me. John followed slowly behind me, and I felt his hand on my shoulder as he passed. Powell saw it too, for his lip curled in disgust. I cannot have any further part in this, he practically spit at Mr. Bell. Affliction is enamored of thy parts, and thou art wedded to calamity. Powell was quoting again, and I shook my head in annoyance. I watched Powell's eyes grow even colder, and I waited for a more dramatic speech. Instead, he locked eyes with me, and he smiled. It's on your head, son, he said quietly before storming out of the house. What the hell was he talking about? John asked once he was gone. And in spite of the tension, we both chuckled.
I returned home to check on my father in early spring and found him even weaker than before. He struggled to walk, his left leg unable to hold his weight, and when he spoke, his voice was choked off by the swelling of his tongue. My mother tended to his every need, and most days he simply stayed in bed. The home was surprisingly quiet, but I could sense Kate's eyes monitoring my every movement. I almost wish she would have given a sign that she was there, and I quickly reprimanded myself for having such a ridiculous thought. As much as I despised her, Kate had become a curiosity to me, and I had grown to accepting of her company. She is usually quiet in the daytime, Mother whispered to me as she returned to the table with a tray of food that Father had been unable to eat. We don't know why. She mostly focuses her attention on John now. She no longer harms the children, I asked, surprised. The visitors who had come out in droves to enjoy the novelty of our family nuisance were long gone. Her distractions from Betsy were no longer available. Not the boys, Mother replied. Betsy still struggles to sleep, but Kate mainly just pesters her. The only time she gets angry at Betsy now is when Joshua comes to visit. I swear she will frighten that boy away. Joshua is a strong man, I tell her, and he loves Betsy. It will take more than an occasional smack for her to get rid of him. Mother smiled sadly. That's what I'm afraid of, she told me, of what she might do next. I glanced up at the ceiling in the direction of Betsy's room. Does she still sleep during the day? Mother nodded. Most days. At night, she wants company. A few of her friends have tried to stay with her, but it only makes Kate angrier. She seems to want Betsy to feel like she has no one. She began sweeping the floor, and I noticed her hands were shaking. She looked like she was trying to remain active, as if she was worried that if she slowed down, something bad would happen. It's beginning to work, I heard her whisper. Late that afternoon, James Johnston arrived to visit Father, and he looked troubled. Is your father sleeping? He asked me. Mother had just turned in for the evening. The house was quiet. A sick father, a frightened mother, a traumatized daughter. The Bell house needed its peace and quiet. I believe so, I replied. Is something the matter? He nodded slowly and asked if we could sit together at the table. I got us both glasses of whiskey, and he smiled gratefully. Sometimes, son, I think you just know when another man needs fortification. You have news about the witch? I asked, dropping my voice. Everyone else might be asleep, but Kate was always listening. He made a face as if he wasn't sure. I can't be sure that what I've learned is related, he began, but I can't rule out that it ain't either. He took a swig from his glass before speaking again. It's complicated. I sat back in my chair and waited patiently. I knew better than to push James, but I was surprised to see him pouring the second glass before he was ready to share what he knew. Do you know if Powell still comes around? He asked. I shook my head. Not that I'm aware of. He made it clear that he vehemently disapproves of Betsy's engagement, but Father refused to break the betrothal. I believe he is done with Betsy. James thought about this for a minute. Well, then, maybe it's best not to borrow trouble if he still isn't working John. Working him? I asked. What do you mean by that? James met my eyes before taking another drink. You know that Powell is the only person to enter this house and not witness Kate's activities, yes? I nodded, but said nothing. I always found that odd. Why would she leave him alone of all people? I tried to get John to consider that, but at the time, he was just happy to have some periods of peace. He liked having Powell around for that reason. But Powell was determined to convince your father that there was nothing otherworldly about this being. Said it was Betsy's way of trying to get attention because he believed Joshua had taken liberties with her. I sat back in my seat, furrowing my brow at him. And Father believed him? James tapped his glass with his fingers. I was beginning to believe for a time that your father was turning away from his faith, that Powell's ideology was convincing him to turn away from God. Father would never do that, I replied hastily, but James shook his head. Think about it, son. If you had always put your faith in the Lord only to have that faith rewarded by being removed from your church and then attacked by the devil, don't you think that that would test your faith? I know it would start to test mine. The Bible tells us not to test the Lord. It doesn't say anything about the Lord not being allowed to test us. Job knew that above all. James reached out and gripped my hand. John, your father is no Job. I think we can both agree on that. Now, say that someone came to you in your time of crisis and told you there was another answer, another possible solution, one that was a complete dichotomy of what you had always believed and now seems to be failing you. That's mighty tempting. For some, perhaps, I replied. What is this really about? What are you trying to say here? James took another long drink from his glass before meeting my eye again. My boys, they came home late one night a while back. They was walking by the school and thought they might say hello to their teacher. They said the schoolhouse was dark, save a single candle burning. They knocked several times. Said they heard voices inside, but no one answered. So they just went inside. My boys know better than that, but something made them. They said they couldn't see Powell, but they heard him speaking. Only it wasn't no language they were familiar with. So they went to look for him, and as they passed his desk, they found this book opened up on the table. My boys said they couldn't read it, that it was written in some kind of code. They weren't trying to snoop, but they said suddenly Powell was behind them and snatched up the book, jerked it right off the table, and held it to his chest. Demanded to know what they had seen. Calvin told them they'd only glanced at the page and hadn't seen anything. But he asked what it was. Powell, he said, acted mighty strange about it. Then told the boys it was just his ciphering book, just math problems written out in Latin. I shrugged. He's an educated man. It's not unusual that he would have books written in Latin. James shook his head. Calvin knows Latin. Knows the Greek language too. Whatever was in that book, he said it wasn't Latin. Whatever it was, Powell didn't want them to see it. But it scared my boys. They said something about it just felt evil. With all the talk of witches, I cut in, but James grabbed my hand again and held my eye. This happened 6 years ago. And there weren't no witches then.
I was very ill. I wish I could say what was wrong with me. The doctors didn't know at the time, and they haven't figured it out since. I spent nearly a month in bed, and given John's state at the time, I expected I'd die. Somehow he managed to summon the strength to care for me, or maybe Kate simply left him alone long enough to do so. Betsy helped as much as she was able. Kate was less easy on her. I lay there, coming in and out of my fever-induced delirium, and almost always Kate stayed on her. When Betsy entered my room, I'd hear Kate screaming at her about Joshua. When she left, I still hear a constant complaint. Stop it, Kate, I whispered one morning as I lay there covered in sweat and shivering. Stop harassing her. It isn't her decision, and you know that. John decides. I coughed hard and found a tiny drop of blood in my hand. I'm going to die. Aren't I, Kate? Something cold caressed my face, as if it was checking me for fever. I'm going to die, I repeated. Will that make you happy? Will you feel satisfied? No, came the whispered reply. You cannot die. I will not allow it. I coughed again and shuddered as I felt the cool touch on my neck and then my ribs. You cannot stop it, I told her, unless you are responsible. I felt the sweat on my brow being wiped away, and then I felt as if a cold rag remained there. No, she whispered. I would never harm you. Then I will take care of you now. I wanted to tell her that I neither needed nor desired her care, but I felt the blankets tucked tight around me and slowly drifted off to sleep. I could hear Kate singing in my dreams. You must eat, Lucy, Kate told me the next morning. Betsy had brought me a tray of food, but the smell was enough to turn my stomach. I don't think I can, Kate. Nothing appeals to me. I can barely stomach the smells long enough to take a bite. I turned my head and sound close to my bed. Saw the rocking chair moving on its own. And I knew Kate was sitting there and she was worrying. What would you like? She asked. And before I could reply, she answered her own question. Grapes. Yes, that makes sense. They don't have much of a smell and you love them. I shall bring you some, yes? I nodded. I didn't honestly expect anything to come of it. I drifted off to sleep again, praying that I wouldn't wake up. Lucy, Kate's voice came a little while later. When I opened one eye, I saw a grape hanging in midair. If you would just open your mouth, I will feed them to you. You must eat soon, or you will starve. Summoned the strength to lift my head from the pillow, allowed her to feed me a grape. It bothered me greatly. Accepting gifts from this being sent from hell to torment us, but prayers were not helping. God has forsaken us, I thought sadly as I bit into the grape and let the juice flood my mouth. It was the most wonderful taste, and I felt tears of both joy and grief slipping from my eyes. We are all damned. You're not damned, Lucy, Kate whispered to me. God loves you as much as he always has. He is testing you, testing your resolve, your love for your children. Ask yourself, what would you do to save them? I ate another grape and then another. What must I do? I asked her. What would appease you, appease God? John must die, she whispered directly into my ear. To free your daughter from this doomed marriage, John must die.
The knock on my door pulled me away from the book I'd been reading aloud to Frederick, and at first I assumed it was the constable again with a new accusation. When I opened the door, I was shocked to see it was Lucy Bell. She looked weak, and she leaned heavily on a cane as she stood on my porch waiting for me. Mrs. Bell, I said, stepping back and allowing her to come inside. This is a surprise and a treat. I'd always liked Lucy. Aside from her poor taste in husbands, she was about as good as any man or woman could be. Is it? She asked, and then she gestured to one of the chairs. Of course, Lucy, I told her, and you don't have to ask. She practically collapsed into the chair, and I sat in the one across from her. You've been unwell, I've heard. Should you be up and moving around? She shook her head sadly. Whether ill or well, I am exhausted. I don't like to complain, but I am finding this life to be more than I can bear. I shushed her, shaking my head. Never say such things. Someone is always listening, and they may take you at your word. I wish they would take me at my word. My prayers accomplish nothing. Day and night, we suffer. She raised her eyes to mine, and I could see tears streaming down her face. I was very ill, Kate, and no one knew how to care for me. But Kate, our Kate, I nodded, a small smile on my lips. Our Kate seemed to know what to do. She brought me food. She was always close by to make sure I was neither too hot nor too cold, and slowly I returned to health. She shook her head sadly. I took food from a demon. It's no wonder God has forsaken us. I patted her hand. She seemed surprised at my touch. God has not forsaken you. None of this has anything to do with God. Surely you know that. Then God should be able to help us, she spat back at me. Why does he leave us in this nightmare? Just as swiftly as it had come on, her anger abated. I'm sorry, Mrs. Batts. I am so tired. I am so worn down, emotionally, spiritually. I nodded again. I could feel her suffering as I held her hand, and I empathized with her and her children. Why have you come here, Mrs. Bell? I asked softly. Her eyes welled up again, and I could see the shame on her face as she struggled to say what she came to say to me. I just need to know. Is this your doing? Have you put this curse on us? I could see that she expected me to be offended, but I'd known eventually she would come to me. No, my sweet lady, I told her. And as much as I despise your husband, I could never do anything to harm you or your children, and I can't say that I know how someone could. She nodded, but I could see she was disappointed. You mean you don't know how to do... I don't understand how anyone could ever wish to harm you. She pursed her lips and tried to fight her tears. Then, do you think you could make it stop? I held her eyes for a long moment, considering this. I didn't want to offend her, but there was no easy way to tell her that even if I could end the curse on her family, my hatred towards her husband would prevent it. No, I replied, and she burst into tears and covered her face with her hands. I leaned forward and rested my hands on her shoulders, trying to comfort her. Finally, she pulled herself to her feet, seeming almost stronger now that she had let all that sadness out. I should go, she said, her voice tight. John wouldn't like it if he heard I was here. I walked her to the door and saw that she no longer seemed to need her cane. It wasn't considered proper to heal someone without their permission, but I honestly didn't think she could make it back home without my assistance. Of course, dear, but please do not feel that you are unwelcome here. You are always welcome. And send one of your children to me if you fall sick again. I'll give them something to help you. She nodded, looking tense. Then she managed a small smile. You are better than they say, Mrs. Batts, she said. I hope you know I can see that. She stepped out onto the porch and then looked back at me and chuckled. I almost wish you were what they say. Then maybe you would know how to fix this. She started down the steps, and I felt her kindness like a stab to my heart. Mrs. Bell, I called after her. She turned back to face me, her expression curious. I said that I couldn't stop it. I never said I didn't know how it could be stopped. Her eyes lit up at my words, and I could see there wasn't nothing she wouldn't do to save herself and her children. John, on the other hand, well, who could be certain? Why don't you come back inside and I'll make us some coffee?
Now, I had not seen the Bells in weeks. I heard chatter in the classroom about the illness that seemed to spread like wildfire. First, Mrs. Bell came down with something that the doctors couldn't diagnose. Then John's tongue had begun to swell in his mouth to the degree that he could barely speak. The boys were healthy, but Betsy's fainting spells had only become more frequent. The last one, she actually fell down the stairs. I heard that she hit her head and didn't wake up for at least 6 hours. Her young cousin, Thenie, told the rest of the class. I kept my head down as I listened to the gossip, pretending to be working on the equations in my ciphering book. Was she all right? Another girl asked. Thenie nodded and waved a hand as if this was an everyday occurrence. And again, in the Bell house, it probably was. What about the wedding? Someone else asked. Will she still marry Joshua? At this, I surreptitiously raised my eyes. Thenie nodded, big grin on her face. I hear it'll be next spring, Betsy said, and she can't wait. I'm surprised Joshua would go through with it, a boy in the back called out. Marrying a girl who's cursed. Wouldn't want that in my house. I tried to hold my sneer, but this was the normal reaction to such things. This boy seemed to understand that which eluded Joshua. Well, that's how you know it's love, Thenie spit back at the boy. When you're in love, you don't concern yourself with such trivial matters. Trivial, the boy began, that I had heard enough. Children, if you have time to gossip, you have time to finish the work on the board. I'm going to assume that you've all done so. I raised my eyebrows at Thenie, and her face paled for a moment. Then, like so many other girls before her, she smiled at me flirtatiously before dropping her eyes to finish her schoolwork. Thenie would marry me in a heartbeat if I asked, but I don't want her. She would never be the partner I knew Betsy could be. A union with her would be nothing more than banality. An hour later, I dismissed the class and went about tidying up the room. I should have made Thenie stay after class to do lines. I could have been distracted by her juvenile attempts to be seductive in the hopes that I would favor her with some poetry or a promise to walk her home. They never asked for much, these silly girls. And again, most of them didn't know what was there to ask for, what a man was capable of giving. I was packing up my bag when I looked up and saw Drew Bell standing in the doorway, looking unsure of himself. Drew? I called to him, watching him shuffle his feet. Well, I'm sorry to bother you, Professor, and I'm sorry that I stopped coming to school. It's just, with everything that's been happening, I raised my hand to silence him. Well, that's all right, Drew. It's been a while since I've seen any of your family. Are y'all well? I have missed my visits. Drew hesitated before shaking his head sadly. My father, he's been very ill. The doctor has come several times, but none of the medicines he's tried has helped. Mother has even suggested letting old Kate Batts come to see if she could figure it out. I held my breath as I listened to this. Kate Batts would only create more confusion in the Bell household. This was one area where John and I agreed. She was not a person with whom one should do business. And did he allow this? I asked cautiously. Drew laughed and shook his head. Over his dead body, my father says. We both chuckled. Anyway, father sent me. He asked me to bring you this. He held up a many times folded piece of paper, and I accepted it. Curious. Perhaps he was ready to see reason cancel Betsy's engagement. I opened the note and read the words, and then read them again. Drew waited patiently as I puzzled over this unexpected correspondence. Professor, father told me to wait until you were ready to come. Will you come? I nodded slowly before beginning to move towards my office. Yes, Drew, I will come. Just give me a minute to pack up my bag. I'll be outside, the boy replied, and I watched until the door closed behind him. Then I threw the note in the fire, went to my closet, pulling out the bag I kept hidden in the back.
Betsy, come away from the door. Betsy pouted at me briefly and then stepped away from her father's closed bedroom door. An hour earlier, Drew had returned home with Mr. Powell, who had promptly gone into John's room with barely even a hello. I assumed he'd be staying for dinner, and I readied an extra plate for him. Just give him Father's plate, Betsy mumbled as she helped set the table. You know he won't eat it anyway. Betsy, don't sass. She looked up at me and then nodded her head solemnly. She was right, though. John had barely eaten in over a week. Why do you think Father asked him to come? It's been months since his last visit, and Joshua said they had parted on bad terms. I avoided her eyes as I began carrying food to the table. Betsy had asked several times what John and Mr. Powell had argued about, but not even Joshua had been willing to tell her. I had a feeling that John had sworn him to secrecy, just as he had done me. Your father must have his reasons, I replied. Maybe he is hoping that the professor has some suggestions for medicines that might help. I doubted this greatly, however. I feared that after months of Kate expressing her disapproval of Betsy's betrothal to Joshua, he might be willing to give in and break their engagement. Perhaps it has to do with the wedding, Betsy said absent-mindedly. Normally she tried not to mention it, but once again Professor Powell was in the house and the house was quiet. I don't see, I began but bit off my words when the door to John's room suddenly opened and Mr. Powell walked out, closing the door behind him gently. He locked eyes with my daughter and a smile formed on his lips. Betsy, he said affectionately. He stepped towards her and took her hands in his. Are you well, my dear? I've missed seeing you. Betsy looked in my direction and slowly pulled her hands back out of his. I'm well, she told him, and then quickly added, I'm very much looking forward to my wedding. I watched the smile fade from Mr. Powell's lips at this, and when I turned my attention back to Betsy, I saw something in her eyes that troubled me. She looked almost pleased with herself, as if she knew these words would cut. Yes, well, I'm sure it will be a most glamorous affair, and you will be very happy. I only wish your marriage would ensure an escape from the spirit that troubles you. But from what I understand, it is highly unpleased with the match. Yes? Betsy's smile faltered as he spoke, and she looked away. I only hope her powers do not grow. We don't want the poor boy getting killed now, do we? At this he laughed, turning to see my reaction before focusing back on Betsy. The color faded from her cheeks and she pushed past him and ran quickly up the stairs. I started to chastise her for being rude, but Mr. Powell told me not to worry myself. Young women are naturally petulant, but they all grow out of it. I'm sure her husband will help her with that if she doesn't mature on her own. He smiled warmly at me and then excused himself and left. Dinner sat on the table uneaten. Now, like John, I no longer had an appetite.
I waited for my son the following evening, counting down the hours by watching the shadows move across the wall. I no longer tried to get out of bed. With no ability to eat, I hadn't the strength to even lift my head. Before dinner, I called my daughter in to speak with me. Talking was hard, as my tongue had swelled till it took up most of my mouth. But the medicine from the doctor helped a little, and today I felt I could try. Father, she said as she entered the room, you wish to see me? I gestured to the chair next to the bed, and she sat down immediately. Did you want me to read to you? I know I'm slow, but I'm willing to try. I think I'm starting to get better at it. I waved a hand, and she fell silent. She looked troubled as I reached for her hand. Just wanted to look on my girl, I said, speaking slowly, and to ask how you feel things are between you and Joshua. Almost immediately, I heard a crash in the kitchen. Closed my eyes sadly for a moment. Betsy no longer reacted to the sounds. Why do you ask me this, Father? Because I need to know. Has he been good to you? The brows knit together, and I knew she could sense what was coming. Of course he is. I don't know why you would think otherwise. Weren't you the one who called him son? Weren't you ready to embrace him just as you would Drew or John? I held up a hand again, and she worked to calm herself. I know that you care for Joshua, but I fear for you, my child. This thing loathes him. I worry it will follow you and kill him before it is finished. You have children with him. Worry that it will harm them. I will not be able to protect them. My eyes welled with tears, blurring my vision of my beautiful daughter. I wiped them away quickly. Needed to see her. Daughter, I am sorry. I do not think I can allow this match to continue. Pain on her face was indescribable. But, Father, I love him. I nodded sadly. I know you do, my girl. Which is why I know you will see that this is what is best for you both. She shook her head, and her chin began to quiver. I must, I replied. She stood up quickly and stared down at me with disgust in her eyes. It was the last thing I wanted. See the little girl who had always shown me so much devotion. Look at me now, with hatred in her eyes. Have you told his parents yet? Shook my head. Not yet. When your brother arrives, I plan to send him to handle it. The tears coursed down her face now, and her anger turned to grief. You would sentence me to a life of loneliness, she asked. Who else would have me? I didn't understand her words, but running out of strength to argue. There is another match for you. John will arrange it. I waited for her to ask who I had planned for her, but instead she turned and ran out of the room. As her feet pounded up the stairs, I could hear her weeping. I allowed myself a few moments to shed tears of my own before closing my eyes to rest. I wasn't sure if I would last long enough to see my son.
I hate him! I hate him! How could he do this? After 3 years of planning, 3 years of knowing that I would be marrying the man I loved, it is simply taken from me? Why? I hate him! I cried out before I could stop myself. I expected some physical response from the witch, a slap or a pinch, and I almost welcomed it. Instead, I felt a soothing hand on the back of my head. She was comforting me? Why? Despite all the pain she had caused me, if she had arms to fling myself into, I would have. Why did you do this? I asked her quietly. Why do you have to hate him so much? Why does it even matter to you? You're dead! The hand that both was and was not there stilled, and I waited for it to strike me. Instead, it lightly touched the back of my neck. It reminded me of something I had felt before, but I couldn't place it. You are worth more than that boy, she whispered quietly. I shook my head. No. You don't know me at all if you think that. You don't know anything. I dropped my voice as I said these words, not wanting Mother or anyone else to hear. I know everything, Betsy Bell. I always have. I've seen it all. The pressure on the back of my neck increased until it almost felt like it was being squeezed. This is what will happen. Joshua will no longer be your betrothed. He will marry another, he will have lots of children and be very happy and successful. If this is true, then how can you say I am worth more than him? Shouldn't a wife wish for an ambitious husband, for a family, a home? The pressure increased and then lessened before it cut off my ability to breathe. Is that really what you want? Such a mundane life? My dear, you deserve a partner. Someone who will consider your every need, including the things you may be unaware of needing. Someone who sees you inside and out. I can give that to you. I don't want that. I want Joshua. I spit at her before flinging the closest thing to me into the wall. I was horrified to see I had just thrown my Bible, but Kate found it hilarious. Forget him. Your father will break off the engagement and you will go on. I hate him, I hissed. I wish he were dead. The room was suddenly very quiet, tension thick in the air. When she spoke again, it was in a voice I had never heard before. My dear, I can give you that as well.
Are you pleased with yourself? Taking away the only happiness in your daughter's life? John kept his eyes closed as I shouted at him. I was surprised at myself. I never spoke to John this way. Perhaps his invalid state had given me courage. Perhaps I simply no longer saw him as a man. His willingness to destroy his daughter's life only ensured that. She is my daughter, he whispered. It is my choice to make. I am choosing differently. To protect them both. To protect you. And just who was she supposed to marry then? She's almost 15 now. She should be at the end of a courtship, not searching for a new one. He opened his eyes slowly to look at me. She won't have to search. I've plans for her. I watched him, at first confused, and then I knew. John, no. But he ignored me. He has some matters to attend to. His wife is sick, dying. His wife? What wife? John hesitated to answer, and I wondered how he could possibly think this man was a better choice for his daughter. They've lived apart for a few years now. She's substantially older than he is and sickly. He said the doctors do not feel she will last long. Well, I hissed. I'm pleased to see it will all work out the way he wants. This sounds encouraging, the timing of it all. I only hope his current wife doesn't hang on long and wreck his plans. John closed his eyes again and did not respond. I could see that he was beyond discussing this. He was going to ruin Betsy's life and marry her to a man she wanted nothing to do with. A man who had little faith in God, a man who, quite frankly, disturbed me. I hope you're happy with yourself. You know, John, neither of us is growing younger, healthier. I would think you would want to finish your days knowing that you've done your all to make your family feel safe and content. You've already failed us on the former. I know that, wife. I know I've been a disappointment to you all. I brought evil into this house, and now, to rid you all of it, I must force our daughter into slavery? Spit out before thinking better of it. If I were well, I would strike you for that, he said weakly. It is nothing like that. Now go and leave me in peace. As much peace as I'm able to have, that is. I walked to the door and turned to stare down at him. You disgust me, I whispered. I'm glad you were weak, so that I can finally tell you that. You are a godless man, terrible father, and a poor excuse for a husband. I will leave you in peace, but just know that I will never again wish it for you.
Oh, where is my son? The hours tick by, and I feel myself growing weaker. I feel such shame and disgust at my own actions. Yet all I can do is lie here. Cannot make amends. Cannot hold my daughter and tell her that I am sorry for the choices that had to be made. I hear her crying above my head, and the sound cuts into me. Soon I am crying again myself. This is not the way it was supposed to be. I brought my family here so that we could have our own land, own a successful farm, become well-respected members of the community. But in the span of 3 short years, it's all fallen apart. I remind myself of how this nightmare began, and once again, curse Kate Batts. Curse her family, her descendants, her land, her home. She was only responsible for the beginning. Everything that followed, I suppose, must be laid at my feet. But I never deserved this. My family never deserved anything so horrible as this. This curse that was laid upon us. And now, there is no way to set it right. I feel myself slipping into darkness, and I struggle to stay awake. Think about my land, count the cows in the fields. Imagine the smells of the tobacco and corn. I remember the black dog carrying the rabbit, the blood that stained the ground. Is that where it began? I remember all the times while tilling the soil, I found a stray bone from one of the savages that once made this land their home. Think of all the times I found more than just a stray bone. And I think about how many times I told one of the slaves, just throw it in the river. I lied to Lucy when I told her I reburied the bodies. I never had. They had been nothing but a nuisance to me when I was trying to start my crops. I didn't see them as people who had once lived and loved and deserved their right to rest in peace. I saw only the shape of their skulls as I pushed through the dirt. I saw how easily it was to dislodge them, and how nice it was that there was a hole ready-made for planting. How many bodies had there been? I don't think I ever started counting. I didn't even care about the jawbone that Drew had dug up. I just didn't want it in my house. Lucy comes back in with a tray of food that she sets on the floor where I cannot reach it, and walks out without saying a word. I don't blame her for this. I damned her when I cursed Kate Batts, when I cheated my other neighbors, when I cut us off from the prospect of salvation and opened the door to the devil. Here, John, a small voice whispers to me, this will help. Push myself up with my elbows and accept the bottle offered to me. Why, thank you, but it's not quite time for this yet. Why not? It asked me. Because I still have matters to settle. I'm waiting for my son. It's time, John. You wanted this, remember? Be free, to no longer feel any pain. I nod slowly in agreement. That is true. The room grows dark as the sun finishes setting in the west, and my eyes grow heavy. There isn't enough light in here. I want to call for Lucy to add another log to the fire. I know she won't come. And I don't want to see her not coming. Blackness awaits. I welcome it. Taste is bitter, and I gag before I can even swallow. Cannot feel my hands. I'm not even sure if it's me holding the bottle. Suppose it doesn't matter. Take another drink and manage to choke it down. That should be enough, the voice whispers. And the bottle is taken from me. Then pain grips me. I am gasping for air. I try to sit up, but I cannot. I hear my son calling to me. And all I can think is, damn it, son. Late. You are too late. Calls to me again. But his voice is so far away. Darkness envelops me, and I wait for a light. There's supposed to be a light. John, I hear the voice say. Never was going to be a light. Not for you.
I was late that night. If I had arrived just a few minutes earlier, perhaps I could have saved him. But deep inside, I know that I would have needed to arrive a few years earlier to save him. My father did a great many things wrong in his life. He had more enemies than friends, but he never seemed aware of that. He would often ask me why I spent so much time away from the family. I didn't have a wife and children of my own, so why not just stay home and take care of the farm that I would inherit? The truth was, when I was away from my father, I could live an ordinary life. I could attend church, I could socialize, I could join the militia and prove myself a man. I remember when we first moved to Red River and settled onto this land. I remember those early days when Father first began digging in that dark Tennessee soil. I remember seeing the bones. I was horrified because it seemed that no matter where we dug, we unearthed a grave. At first, Father just kept looking for a different spot of land so he wouldn't be planting on top of graves. Eventually, he stopped looking. The bones merely disposed of. I tried to see things my father's way, but I just couldn't. When I finally married in 1828, I built on a piece of land south of my father's home, and I didn't dig up the dead so I could profit off the living. I gave up on seeing goodness in my father long ago. When the horror struck, it really didn't surprise me. The devil will have his due, you see. When I look back, I know I could have been a better son. I could have been a voice of reason before he slipped into madness. But I just couldn't do it. I didn't want him to die. But I can easily see how I killed John Bell.
The evil entered the house and attacked me first. Suppose I must have been the one to bring it in. It went after my father next, and there was nothing to be done. Nothing satisfied it. All it ever asked for is that I not marry Joshua. But like a child, I insisted on following through with my plans. Until my father died that night, and I remember feeling relieved because he wasn't able to tell my brother to break off the engagement. The Gardners never knew it was what he wanted. If Mother knew, she didn't say. We made our plans, and I looked forward to a happy life with the man I loved. But the spirit didn't leave. It had wanted Father dead, and so we assumed after he was gone that it would be satisfied. But it wasn't. For 5 more months it attacked me and my brothers and then Joshua. In the spring of 1821, I broke from Joshua and refused to see him again. He begged me not to leave him. But I could not damn him to a life with this thing that refused to allow me to be happy. He moved away shortly thereafter and got married to a very pretty girl whose name, well, it didn't escape me. I never wanted to know it. I asked myself many times, if I just accepted my father's will, would he have died that night? I remember the way John looked at me and Mother and saw the indifference in my eyes, how he recoiled. All I know is that in the end, the spirit cared more about my marriage than it did about my father's death. I should have done what he wanted for the good of the family. I should have not have told the spirit that I wanted him dead. I suppose I killed John Bell.
My family didn't like the idea of me marrying Betsy after John got himself excommunicated. Well, they worried about the impact it would have on my status in the community if I married a daughter with a man with that kind of reputation. Well, it took about 6 months for me to convince them that the fault lay only with her father and that I wouldn't marry another. She was my one love. But when that witch began attacking her, all I wanted to do was save her, protect her. And I begged to marry her sooner, but she was so young. She was so young. And she didn't deserve to suffer in the place of her father, and I resented him for it. He should have killed himself before he allowed anyone or anything to harm her. And I know that I would have easily given up my own life for hers. And when he died, I have to say, I felt happy. Now she could live a happy life and she would be free. But that evil didn't leave. And on the day they put John in the ground, the spirit was there, laughing and singing while the rest of us mourned. And when they sang hymns, it would laugh and sing tavern songs, and it wasn't until the last mourner left that it was quiet. I knew that day that Betsy would never find happiness. So when she told me it was over, that it was what her father had wanted but never got the chance to tell my family, I begged her to give me another chance. That I would take her as far away as we needed to go to escape it. Well, there is no place far enough, she told me. And eventually she will kill you, or you will leave me. And I'd rather lose you now, like this, than face it in the future. And so I left the Red River, and eventually I met a girl that had eyes almost as lovely as Betsy's, and I asked her to be my bride. And we had children together, and we were able to lead a happy life, but I never forgot about Betsy. And I've thought it over from time to time, and I do feel responsible. I pushed my parents to let me be with her when they warned me how it would end, and I wouldn't have let her father end our engagement had he tried. I would have taken Betsy and run. Or perhaps I would have killed her father. She meant everything to me. And my actions were never malicious. And I know that everything I might have done would have been for the well-being of Betsy. My love was her undoing. And his. I killed John Bell.
I could not take back the awful words I spoke to John that night, and what truly horrified me is that I didn't really want to. After so many years of being ashamed of the man I once loved, it had felt so good to tell him how I felt about him. I think back on how I went to see Kate Batts, hoping she could come over and remove the curse from our home. When we went back inside, she sat me down and said, "Lucy, that thing wants John dead. The best way to get rid of it is to make that happen." I was horrified. Was she telling me to kill my husband? No, she said. You don't have to do anything yourself. Sometimes simply not doing something is enough. She pointed over towards Frederick, her invalid husband, and said to me, "You think if he died tomorrow, anyone could blame me? He only lives because I choose to care for him. But what good is he? All I would have to do is not feed him, and he would be gone. Let John kill himself. All you have to do is make it a little bit harder for him to live." Could have given John his medicine more often. Could have made sure he was eating enough to survive. I could have insisted that Betsy do what he asked of her instead of blaming John for what was happening to us. When I saw he was dead, I didn't know what to think. How much of his demise was because of me and how much was because of something else? I will never know, and so I stay quiet. It's better if people don't know that I killed John Bell.
Oh, how history will tell my story. Oh, wait. It won't. I always hated the man, and I will never deny that. He represented everything that was wrong to me about our community. We all like to pretend that we were willing to help our neighbors, not slander them, be good Christians, do what the Bible tells us to. Ha! John deserved everything he got, if you ask me. I honestly thought he deserved worse. When Lucy came to me and I told her how to solve her problem, I didn't think she'd actually do it. Lucy was always so good and sweet, but I could sense she was losing patience with John's inability to do what needed to be done. She was tired of being tied to a man she could no longer see as good. I offered her more than advice that day, but she wasn't comfortable with it. I tried to tell her the things I could see in her, the sight she had that she'd most likely passed on to her daughter as well. As I'd predicted, hearing this terrified her. She immediately blamed herself for the evil in her home, and at first, I thought she might take her own life. I managed to convince her that she was still good, even if she was a bit of a seer. I always hoped she would come back and let me share more with her, but I never saw her again. After John died, those who had heard the entity had called itself Kate quickly blamed me. They accused me of all numbers of terrible crimes. The mothers who gave birth to stillborn babies now thought that I had killed their children. If any animal died, it was my fault. I was no longer just a witch. I was a vicious killer as well. Eventually, we left Red River before we could be run out by pitchfork-carrying lunatics. The thing that attached itself to the Bell household had nothing to do with me. Did I hate John? Oh, yes. But I was not alone in that. His own wife loathed him enough to at least consider taking matters into her own hands. Now, whether or not she did, I don't really know. Let those secrets stay buried. The dead should be entitled to their privacy. And though I do know what really haunted the Bell home, I'm sorry, I cannot be the one to tell you. So, if it makes you happy to hear it, fine. I killed John Bell.
John was a good man, a good, misunderstood man. Most of the time. I warned him so many times about his actions and how they would eventually come back on him. I can say that I most often felt he had good intentions, but he could be mighty selfish. If it was for the good of his family or his wallet, that was what mattered most to him. I don't know what caused the disturbance in his home. I only know that there were some dangerous elements at work. Some say Betsy caused all of it herself, that there never was a spirit, that she was a skilled ventriloquist. But anyone who was there and witnessed the poor child being slapped by unseen hands, watched her hair being yanked out by the roots, anyone who watched chairs and tables being thrown and dishes floating in midair, they will tell you that you are a fool for questioning what happened in the Bell home. I did my best for Betsy. I warned her father that I thought Powell was up to no good, that his being the only person to not witness any disturbances should have been a good indicator that something was very wrong with him. My boys told far too late about what they saw when they were young, according to them. They were whipped in front of their classmates when they told another person about Powell. The day Betsy and Powell were wed was one of the hardest of my life. In the end, I think it was guilt over her father's death that led her to go through with it. I did my best to keep track of her, but we eventually lost touch. I have a feeling that Powell didn't allow her many friendships. I should have told John the story my boys told me, but his mind was already starting to slip at that point. And I admit that it was hard to be around him when I saw him start to lose his faith. In my own small way, I killed John Bell, but I feel far more responsible for Betsy's life.
John wanted to die. He was tired against fighting an enemy he could neither see nor touch. He was tired of watching his poor daughter suffer. He thought that in dying, he would free his family from the spirit that was attacking him. He was wrong. The spirit continued tormenting the Bell home until after Betsy broke off her engagement to Gardner and agreed to marry me. After that, no one was harmed under the Bell roof again. The bottle found on his bedside table contained a heavy concentration of arsenic. John knew this. He asked me to share with him the name of a drug or poison that could kill him quickly. And upon his request, I provided it. But not before making him swear to tell Betsy to marry me. John took the poison himself, but he was pretty much mad at that point. Can it truly be called suicide? Arsenic, sadly, does not offer a quick or painless death, and I'm sure it was a dreadful experience. But I always found it hard to pity the man. There was a spirit haunting the Bell family, but it wasn't any witch. It was a creation of his daughter's making once she reached puberty and began to find herself interested in the company of men. I enjoyed her company. She never told a soul, not even her mother. After I had my way with her, I made sure she understood what it meant. She was no longer pure, and therefore no other man would ever want her. The shame and grief she felt over this manifested into physical torments that could not be explained by God nor man. The voices heard in the Bell home, they were created by me. The furniture moving, the blankets being torn from the beds, the creatures roaming the grounds of the Bell property, my doing. You see, I'm a man of science, and I laugh at those who put their faith in an unknown God, believing that there is some higher power watching over them who loves and will relieve their struggles. But I do have my own spiritual beliefs, and I've witnessed the miracles of my faith. It was not hard to curse the Bell family after John was removed from the church. It was not hard to manipulate Betsy after stealing her innocence. And it was not hard to convince strangers who came from all around the country that there was a witch who had taken over the Bell home. Sometimes, the easiest way to convince others to believe in something impossible is to be the only one who says they don't believe. But I did believe, because I was the one who placed the curse. In the end, Betsy broke with Gardner to protect the stupid boy, and he moved away, married another woman, and he became wealthy in his own right and led a relatively happy life. But he never stopped loving Betsy, and I don't believe she ever stopped caring for him either. My first wife didn't pass away nearly as quickly as I had hoped. That was easily remedied. I had only married her for an eventual inheritance, you see. For 3 full years after breaking her engagement, I comforted Betsy, wooed her, always reminded her that I had already taken what she was due to give a husband. Finally, I wore her down and we married in 1824. She bore me 8 children, 4 of whom lived past infancy. I never told her the truth of the family curse. It was always better to have it in my back pocket to remind her on those nights when she did not desire to share my bed. I buried the cursed pages of my ciphering book on the Bell property the day after I wed Betsy, and it remains there to this day. No one has ever found it. No one ever will, as those pages have long since rotted away. Once evil is planted in the ground, it spreads quickly and erects its own barrier. Unfortunately, the evil spread further than I had anticipated, and people will always seek to discover the cause. But no one has ever come close to uncovering the truth. No one suspected the kind and penniless professor who would seek to care for a cursed young woman. But if anyone is really interested in knowing the truth of the matter, let me begin by saying I killed John Bell.